Hello and welcome to Solar Works for Illinois. I'm Tim Montague, your host. This is the monthly webinar from Continental Electrical in Chicago. Today we continue our net zero journey. The topic is zero energy homes coming to a neighborhood near you. Our speaker is Edminster of the Net Zero Energy Coalition. Before I introduce Ann properly, I just want to give a quick heads up about our future events coming up on Solar Works for Illinois. In April, we have Illinois Solar Industry Update, 10 Things You Want to Know with John Carson. We are going to touch on the Illinois Solar Industry Update coming up with John Carson of Trajectory Energy on April 30th, 10 Things You Want to Know. Then in May, we have Nico Johnson of Suncast. If you don't know Nico's well-known podcast, check it out. Just Google that, Suncast with Nico Johnson. Nico and I are going to break down the commercial industrial solar industry here in the Midwest and talk about 5 steps to energy independence. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Ann Edminster of the Net Zero Energy Coalition. Ann is a leading international expert on net zero and efficient green homes, founder and principal of Design Avenues, and consults with builders, developers, homeowners, supply chain clients, design firms, investors, and many other constituents from local to international organizations. She is most notably the author of the award-winning book from 2009, Energy Free, Homes for a Small Planet, and that book is available on Amazon.com. Welcome to Solar Works for Illinois. Thank you so much for being here.
Great, thank you, Tim. And I take it you're advancing the slides for me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, let's hit it. Let's go to the next one. There's just the title. All right, so the presentation is broken up into these 4 segments. Very briefly, I'll go into what goes into a zero energy home. This may be basic information for some of you and not for others, so that's kind of a necessary prelude to the rest. Then I'll talk about the various drivers behind the trend towards zero energy homes and address the question of, is it a big deal? How is it a big deal? Maybe it's a big deal. And then finally, where we see this part of the industry headed next. So let's go to the next. All right, so in simplest terms, zero net energy means that we're balancing out the home's energy production with its energy consumption on an annual basis. And there's a lot of nuance to the way various organizations define this more particularly, but we won't go there quite now. That would be a subject for an hour or several all by itself. So this is at a really basic level. One thing I do want to mention is the term net is starting to disappear from the dialogue around zero energy for the simple reason that the net refers to the annual equation. And for those of us who are immersed in this work, we all know what we're talking about if we say zero energy. And for folks who are not as close to it, the net really requires an explanation anyway, whereas the term zero energy seems to be fairly intuitively graspable for folks at this stage in our nascent industry's development. So we're finding it a little easier to converse in terms of just zero energy. Let's go forward. Next slide. Okay, so what we're finding initially is there are all types of zero energy homes. And I think in the early days of this movement, there was a general perception that this was really sort of a niche boutique part of the market. That's really not the case. Certainly we do have our luxury examples, but we've also got affordable homes, both single and multifamily, spec developments, and production. So all sectors of the market are represented with zero energy homes. Next slide. We also find them in pretty much all North American climates, and I've just shown one example in one of our more extreme climates as an illustration. Let's move on. So all of these homes or projects have certain things in common. They are paying close attention to form and orientation. A lot of emphasis on the enclosure performance, so roof, walls, floor, foundation, windows, doors, and then they're all looking at ways of producing comfort, heating, cooling, and mechanical ventilation in super efficient ways, and then best-in-class electric devices, so lighting, appliances, and electronics. Of course, not all those are supplied by the builder or specified by the designer, but those are the ingredients that go into a zero-energy home. It also requires that not only these elements be in the design, but of course they have to be built and commissioned in similar levels of, let's say, stringency in order to operate at zero energy once we add in a renewable energy system. Next slide. So that's pretty much what it takes. Add those ingredients, sort of like, here's your baking, add water, you get zero net energy. I think one part of the conversation, though, that really is lacking frequently is the fact that a zero energy home is a home with something else. It adds a utility or a piece of a utility functionality. And so when we talk about a zero energy home, I think we're missing an opportunity to point out that there's quite a bit more to it. We're, in effect, transferring some of the money that has traditionally gone to a utility into the home itself, paying less to the utility, and the net effect that we have more control over the energy systems and bills in a zero energy home by virtue of including that partial utility functionality. Next slide. So we have more benefits as well. So these are all positives, hence the thumbs up on both the less side and the more side of the equation here. So we're reducing all sorts of risks associated with construction because we are paying more attention to the quality of that enclosure and the ability to provide comfort in adverse conditions. We're reducing noise through better quality enclosure, less wait time for hot water because that's another system that gets a bit more attention. And of course, by really controlling the energy performance of the home and requiring less from the utility, it means we are less vulnerable to changes in cost from utility supplied energy over time. Meanwhile, we result in greater levels of comfort, higher quality indoor air, increased equipment reliability, and of course, energy self-sufficiency. I like that the title of your May webinar, Tim, that really looking more at energy self-sufficiency. So while a zero energy home is connected to the grid, we have more of those capabilities within control. Next slide. So here's the way I really encourage people to think and talk about a zero energy home. It's something that has a very significant added value as compared to the garden variety home that isn't zero energy. It's not the same product. It's not the same value. It's an increased value. And interestingly enough, may actually carry the same price, however, but need not. There are builders all over North America who are figuring out how to deliver zero energy homes at prices very comparable to the prices that people are paying for conventionally performing homes. On the other hand, it is an added value, so we should also consider that when we do see an add to the price tag. Next slide. Okay, so that covers the bases. No great mystery or nothing mysterious or exotic, I should say, in the zero energy home equation. So let's move on to the drivers behind the trends. Very short bit of history here. This is collapsing a 40 some odd year timeline into a single slide. But in the 70s and 80s, the US experienced an energy crisis based on the Arab oil embargo. And that was really the beginning of any serious response to reducing energy consumption of homes, which really began with looking at insulation levels back in the 70s. In the 90s, in Germany, passive house movement was developed by Dr. Wolfgang Feist, based on inspiration, however, from a US institution, the Rocky Mountain Institute. And then we had in the mid-2000 decade, Habitat for Humanity in Metro Denver created the first zero energy home, I should say the first home that was actually able to provide documentation of operating at zero net energy. And that project was published in Energy Design Update back in 2006 or early 2007. Now, fast forward to about a year ago when the Net Zero Energy Coalition completed our 2017 inventory, we were up at about 14,000 what I would call ZNE-ish homes, meaning they're plus or minus in the realm of zero energy performance throughout the US and Canada. And by the way, that inventory is underway right now for 2018. So we will be concluding the inventory soon. Let's go on to the next slide. And by the way, that's a reminder that if you have zero energy homes and you think they may not be included in the inventory, we certainly want to hear about them. We don't publish data on individual projects, so there should be no privacy concerns. We aggregate the data to provide a picture of what's emerging in the industry. So this graph, the underlying curve shapes come from the New Buildings Institute and represent commercial buildings in the world of zero. And you can see a few landmarks along this timeline. I've shamelessly self-promoted here with a picture of my book cover at publication at the end of 2009. And another landmark, the California Public Utilities Commission setting, quote, big, bold zero energy goals in 2008. That was pursuant to an executive order by then Governor Schwarzenegger in 2006. And the reason I've shown that marker for those of you in Illinois and beyond is because California turns out to be a pretty big factor in the growth and advance of zero energy practice in the US. Let's go to the next slide, Tim. So now overlaid on the NBI commercial building graph with its numbers along the left axis, I'm showing the residential numbers now on the right axis. So we started collecting data in 2015. So the big dots are the, again, number one house in 2006, the 2015, 16, and 17 data in big dots over there showing the jumps in numbers between 2015, 2016, and then 2016 to 2017. Right now, with our count for 2018, we're just at about 20,000 units, and we have 1 week left to collect data before we actually start crunching that data. And I expect we're going to be well over 20,000 units. So not quite sure what the percent growth will be this year, but pretty healthy jump again. So let's move on. Obviously, that's still a really small number of housing units in comparison with all the homes we have in the US, but it's a healthy growth, and we hope we're going to see that go exponential and really transform the industry soon. Meanwhile, among the things that the inventory has revealed are these different waves. The first wave of early adopters, as I mentioned, really was dominated by single-family sort of luxury bespoke homes. The second wave, interestingly enough, and I think somewhat surprisingly to many, is really dominated by affordable and multifamily projects. So as the inventories in both 2016 and 2017, we had about 50% and then 50% above were multifamily. So this is by no means a boutique movement. And then on the next slide, you'll see our third wave, which really hasn't completely hit yet, but is starting to be felt in the stats, is the emergence of spec and production builders into the zero energy movement. And of course, once that wave hits in full force, it is really going to represent a lot of building activity. So we're quite excited to see that, as well as the continuing growth in the multifamily sector. So what's behind this, when we drill down into the numbers and start to see where the activity is concentrated and start to do some inquiry about those numbers, we find that there are two primary factors in all this. One, of course, is policy driving towards zero energy. And I refer to that as the top-down influence. And that occurs at state level, most obviously in both California and Massachusetts. More and more states are starting to rev up in that quarter, particularly states in the Northeast and the Northwest. And then state policy in turn drives adoption at the municipal level. So we see many cities that then respond to state policy, getting their own programs going and really fostering engagement with zero energy development. But at the same time, the bottom-up component works also to influence the state level. So there are numerous examples of cities, notice the 3 Bs here, Berkeley, Boston, and Burlington, ranging in size from fairly small to quite large, of course, where those cities have in their own turn influenced the state policy by creating local programs that end up encouraging enough activity in this sector to provide proofs of concept that make it much more politically viable for state government to take action in this regard. Let's go to the next slide. Slide, Tim. There we go. Okay, so there's an example too of grassroots is even at the individual level, persons and companies are really making things move on this. And I've just shown a few examples here in different locales where we're seeing the influence of specific companies and their work. And in these cases, I've spoken to almost all of these builders and consulting firms about their role. And the story with them is almost always the same. We just decided this was something we needed to do. We went ahead and did it. We've built a business proposition for ourselves that's working very nicely, growing in a very healthy fashion, and starting to actually create more activity in the area around them. Again, proof of concept by example. The building industry is very much a Mikey likes it kind of place to hang out, where a lot of builders kind of want to see somebody else do something new and creative first and see how that flies before they jump in the pool at the deep end. So I love mixing metaphors. Okay, so a little closer glance at some of the policy angle here. The big yellow wedge in the upper right, of course, is all the other states. So we can kind of ignore that for the time being. But you'll see that the number 1 and the number 2 state, respectively, are California and Massachusetts. Massachusetts, of course, being a lot smaller, but it's also got a lot smaller population. So, and then some of the other states that are moving with this. Now, those states, if you follow the ACEEE, American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, every year they evaluate all the states based on how advanced their energy policies and programs are. California and Massachusetts pretty much have ongoing arm wrestling competition between positions number 1 and number 2. And so you really see that reflected in our zero energy inventory numbers. Let's go to the next slide. And here's another fun way to, another lens to shine on all of this. I had the opportunity to get to know a number of the folks involved in the Boston and Massachusetts energy arena, and was able to sort of recreate this very rough and I'm sure highly incomplete timeline of some of the events that have caused Boston and Massachusetts, respectively, to take leadership positions in this arena. So you can see the roles of individuals and organizations and governmental agencies in creating this trend. And we could probably create a similar timeline in all of the other leading market areas. But the real takeaway here is that there's a role for almost everyone. As private citizens, we can influence what's happening in our local governments, our municipalities and counties and so forth. And those in turn can encourage development projects that are very progressive in those locales. Again, that really can create the political leverage that's needed for action at state level. So I want to encourage everybody, whether you're private builder, architect, activist, city official, get involved. Okay, so now let's see, is it a big deal? The numbers suggest, well, maybe not so much, but there's some other things, other ways to look at this. So first of all, I'd mentioned that we do see rapid growth is a very significant factor. And for those of you who've looked at exponential functions or compounding interest in finance and so forth, I think it's easy to recognize that our 20,000 and some units, if these trends continue, are going to represent a very substantial force in the proximate future. Go ahead, next one. I think another thing that maybe is not so intuitively obvious, but I think is really an important observation here, is that most of our projects that we have documented in the net zero energy inventory, residential inventory, these are not one-off projects. These are business undertakings, whether they are single family projects of 2 or more units or multifamily projects. These are all done for the purposes of furthering business opportunities. They are not just single family homeowners saying, I would like a single family zero energy home for myself. So people are operating this on a very pragmatic scale. So the other thing about, is it a big deal as well? Is it a big deal to jump into this pond? And I'll let you decide at the end, but I've already made up my mind, and I'm going to show you what I believe are the essential steps in the pathway to getting into zero energy design and construction. So first step is asking the right question, and let's go to the next slide for that. So I've seen a lot of attention in really research done by reputable organizations, and I nevertheless feel that that research is often very flawed because it starts by asking the question, how much extra will it cost to get to net zero energy? The premise underlying that question is, we're going to take what we normally do and we're going to add stuff to it to get to zero net energy, which is a very different approach to addressing this goal compared with asking the question, well, how would we achieve a zero energy project within our budget? Those questions drive fundamentally very different processes, and I highly recommend this article that I've shown on the left as a deeper dive into this question of how we think about it and how the way we think about this drives our design process. Bruce Coldham, who's now retired, co-founder of Coldham and Hartman Architects in the Boston area, wrote this very eloquent article a number of years ago, actually a decade ago, and it's still as relevant as it ever was. Now, the second step in approaching zero net energy design and construction relatively painlessly and successfully are really setting goals early. It's I work with a lot of project teams, and they've often adopted an advanced performance goal well into a project. They get to a certain point and some member of the project team says, hey, maybe this should be a zero energy project, or maybe we should go fossil fuel free, or we'd like to be a LEED Platinum or a Living Building Challenge project. I commend all of them. It's the hard way to do it midstream. Starting early makes it much, much simpler. So some of the decisions that should be faced are, what kind of fuel sources will you use in the project? And I think that question is generally bypassed because in conventional projects, everyone's operating assumption is, well, we're going to use whatever fuel sources there are, whatever is normal and present at a given location at a given time. So where I'm in California, for example, the sort of normal fuel mix is electricity and methane, or so-called natural gas. But you don't necessarily have to choose those. And increasingly, we're driving our clients to choosing all electricity for their fuel sources, because electricity is the one type of fuel that we can produce more of as clean, renewable energy on a sustainable basis. We cannot produce more or nearly sufficient renewable anything else on a sustainable basis. So, and turns out we can actually serve all of our household needs with electricity. Second goal to really target is, well, what exactly is your energy performance? Do you want to achieve zero energy? Is there an energy use intensity, or EUI, that's an appropriate target for your locale or within your jurisdiction? And then finally, but by no means last, client commitment is critical to this. Anytime you're targeting performance goals that are outside the norm, the client absolutely has to be behind it. The financial support has to be there to pursue these goals, because while it need not cost extra, it does require a steadfast dedication to pursuing the goals in order to get every member of the team to conform to those. And speaking of team, this is the next critical element. I've digested my observations from my own project experience, as well as those from many, many other practitioners I've spoken with, down to these 4 characteristics. Your team needs to exhibit extremely high levels of commitment to the project goals, creativity in order to be willing and capable of stepping outside the norm in terms of design and construction practice. Experience, so experience broadly writ within their respective discipline, but also ideally experience in high performance projects. And then finally, engagement. And this is my shorthand for being able to play well with others, being a collaborator by nature. Now, any one of these, if it's lacking in the project team, can be an Achilles heel. The one where I find, I've actually done a poll with thousands and thousands of people in different groups about which of these attributes they think might be expendable on the project team. The only one that all of these thousands of people are willing to give up on occasionally is experience, and never experience of the team as a whole. However, an inexperienced team member who exhibits all of the other characteristics and is inexperienced can still be a fabulous contributor, provided there's a body of experience in the team as a whole. Excuse me. Okay, so the next thing is the focus on fundamentals, and we've actually got several slides because there are a range of fundamentals, but again, nothing exotic. I want to re-emphasize that. So I'm not going to read this to you. I know you're all very capable readers, but this is just a reminder of some of what I conceive of as the fundamentals in each of these categories. So form and orientation, some of the things that maybe aren't thought about in a more routine design that doesn't have these high performance energy goals. So the ability to have enough space for all the stuff that's involved. So your roof space for some of the heating, ventilating, air conditioning, and water heating equipment that might normally not go into conditioned space and really should go into or must go into conditioned space. And there are, of course, ancillary benefits of a somewhat simpler enclosure, meaning less time, cost, and risk associated with waterproofing, insulation, air sealing, those forms. Let's go on to the next slide. So the number 2 element of fundamentals relates to the enclosure. Again, so that among the things we look at are the framing or the structural system, both cavity and exterior insulation, type, detailing, quality installation, very, very important, and the continuity of the air vapor and moisture barriers. I want to point you to the gray box on the right, the small type, which you certainly won't be able to read in its entirety while I'm chatting here. These are here really to just highlight a number of resources of the hundreds that are included in a very short guide that I created for the American Institute of Architects California Council about a year ago. And that resource, while it is written for California architects, is by no means exclusive to Californians nor to architects. There are a few things that are specific to California's circumstance, but I think it's a very useful guide for many. So a little bit more about enclosures, air leakage control, which I've already mentioned, but honestly, I don't know if it's possible to harp on this issue enough. You all are in a much colder climate than I am, colder and warmer, as a matter of fact, and more humid. So a lot more what many folks would call real weather than we have in coastal California. So it may not be quite as necessary to emphasize this, but we find, all the teams I work on, that getting this aspect of the enclosure done in a satisfactory way is the thing that causes the most aggravation, brain damage, and arguably unnecessary expense if it were approached in a more comprehensive way. And that comprehensive way would be providing the details in air sealing cross. It's embedded in the American Institute of Architects Zero Energy Primer that I referred to here. There's a link to that primer at the end of this slide deck. So folks, do you make slides available, Tim?
Yep, they'll be on the website.
Great. Yeah, so all the links will be at the end. Okay, so a little bit more about enclosure. Enclosure, honestly, the enclosure is the bedrock of a high performance home. So it deserves all the attention you can give it. Again, some maybe not entirely obvious issues about windows. Views are a big issue for custom homes, and those views, in my opinion, often lead to a little too much glass area. One of my favorite quips to project teams is, I don't think your needs really enjoy the view. Do we have to have glass down to floor level? So everything we can do to be reasonable and judicious in providing glass area that's appropriate for the functionality, doesn't compromise performance. And then, of course, the more obvious aspects of the specification map. Now, moving on to the third aspect of the fundamentals, efficient mechanical system. I want to point out that equipment efficiency is really the only factor in HVAC performance that normally gets any attention. While it is certainly important, all of these other factors can be equally, if not more influential in the overall performance of an HVAC system design. So let's go ahead and roll forward, since all this will be available to you to read the gory details. Similarly, there are some factors, mechanical systems, condition space, the equipment, and as designers, locating water heater and taps as together as possible, a mental shift, as opposed to scattering them all over a plan. Again, equipment efficiency is important, but not necessarily be all end all, because we have many other factors that go into the overall equation. Let's go forward. So factor number 4, best in class electric devices. If we were doing this live, we would have another quiz to find out what people think best in class means. The usual answer, by the way, is Energy Star. And yet Energy Star, in fact, has become almost a de facto for performance rather than representing top tier. So much so that the EPA has introduced its own top tier, referred to as Energy Star Most Efficient. So I've listed that resource as well as 2 others in the orange box at upper right. My personal favorite is enerv.com. That's a screenshot of an NRV page below it, showing the information that is available through this incredibly useful code. It should be used quite a lot early on in design and consistently as changes are made to determine the impacts of different variables. So this graph here illustrates one project that I worked on where we wanted to really understand the influence of the different variables. So initially we vary them one at a time to see, well, we've got some significant and less significant influences here. Once we understand where the big influences are, we can focus our efforts more on fine-tuning performance and putting together packages of features and performance specifications. And then also looking at how much are we paying for those features. Another aspect of checking progress is balancing energy production capacity with energy consumption. So the energy model will give you information about the energy consumption, estimated, of course. We haven't introduced the human element yet. And then getting information on potential solar production. And there are a variety of resources to help with that. Online, we have on the National Renewable Energy Laboratories website, nrel.gov, there is the PV watts calculator, and then, of course, the more reliable and more site-specific would be something from a solar vendor for your area. So looking at whether you're going to achieve that balance or not. Okay, and then finally, the last critical piece is really making all these important design and construction decisions stick. And I cannot tell you how many times I've seen projects stumble and just really hit challenges during construction because there was a failure on the part of the design team to include all of the critical decisions into the construction documents, contract documents. The reason they're called contract documents is because it is the contracts that allow us to really bind everyone to the decisions that were made. So all of these things we talk about have to make their way into the CDs. Okay, let's move on. Okay, and then finally also in CDs, we don't want to neglect the other aspects of human and planetary health when we're putting all that effort into the CDs. So I also want to encourage everyone to look for the other performance aspects of our materials and products that matter. Next slide, please. Okay, so back to the question of whether it's a big deal or not. I think this is a really nice, hard-hitting stat from a very reputable institution called Lux Research. They did a study a number of years ago and found that there's a really staggeringly enormous potential market for zero-energy buildings in the very near future. So 2025 is now just 6 years away, and I think there's an opportunity for everyone who's listening here to be a part of that market. And I would like to think that I've given you some evidence that it might be a big deal in terms of opportunity, but it really isn't such a big deal in terms of being a hard lift. Let's move to the next slide. Okay, so where are we headed next? Just a little snapshot of a few things on the horizon. Next slide. So besides the basic components that I've already enumerated, some of the things that are starting to come forward increasingly in the zero energy residential arena are battery storage, electric vehicles, not strictly part of the home, but of course the charger is, and in terms of the energy equation, more and more developers, buyers, and designers are really interested in providing not only for the household energy needs, but also for the occupants' transportation energy needs via EVs. So that's something that will increasingly be felt in the evolution of this field. We're also seeing more performance monitoring devices. The jury is out as to whether they actually will influence energy consumption a lot, but there's more and more interest in including them for two reasons. One, as a society, we need to cultivate more energy literacy in the populace. So this is a good way to start. And secondly, a lot of the residents of zero energy homes are kind of the early adopter mindset. and more interested in this information than others. So we expect to see the Prius effect in at least some segment of the occupants of zero energy homes, where these devices may be more effective with that population than perhaps across the general population. And I mentioned earlier that there's a pretty strong drive, very political will to be able to impose all electric construction from the outset. And then finally, we're also seeing a need for more demand response operability in zero energy homes, recognizing that zeroing out energy on an annual basis doesn't necessarily address the day in, day out, hour by hour energy needs at grid scale. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about that. This is a big issue in California, as well as a number of other markets, Hawaii, Arizona, and so forth, where as we have gotten more and more solar production, this little curve represents the differential between demand and production at each hour of the day, and you see several years represented here, from the year 2012 at the top to down to 2020 projection at the bottom of the graph. So what's called the belly of the duck there represents the amount of solar energy production in excess of what is required at that particular hour of the day. Then what you'll also see going up to the neck and then the head of the duck is when the sun goes down, all of a sudden we have the opposite. We have a significant deficit between the amount of energy needed and energy being produced. And that steep ramp represents a time when the solar is shutting down and there's a need to bring online the other means of energy production, which by and large are older, less efficient, and therefore dirtier sources of energy. So it is this that's really driving both the need for more energy storage, both at the individual building level and at grid level, and the need for those demand controls that allow us to throttle back some of the production when it's needed and throttle back the demands and control some of the demands. So for example, we're seeing the introduction of smart appliances that will allow, for example, a delayed start on a dishwasher or a washing machine or various types of appliances until after the peak has passed. So these are some of the emerging things. And then of course, again, we need to phase out natural gas, which is a fossil fuel whose combustion produces significant greenhouse gas emissions. And the interesting things about CO2 and the other greenhouse gases is their global warming potential varies as a function of what time horizon we're looking at. Now, within the 20-year horizon, methane, which is what so-called natural gas really is, its global warming potential is 87 times higher than carbon dioxide. So getting rid of methane is really an imperative. It's also been found quite recently that the leaks in gas lines are considerably higher than had been previously estimated. And when we account for those leaks, so-called natural gas is just about as polluting as coal. So I think there's a pretty widespread misperception that natural gas is, well, natural and not a bad thing. And in fact, it is a significant problem for us in terms of climate change. And then of course we have the hazards caused in earthquakes and subsequent explosions, as well as fires from other sources, which are a very big concern for us in the West. And then finally, gas appliances also are really not healthy for us to have in our homes. The byproducts include formaldehyde. They're implicated in high rates of asthma and many other things. So there are lots of good reasons to get rid of natural gas in our residential construction. Next slide. So where this all is boiling down to is, as I mentioned, more and more emphasis on energy storage, demand response grid controls, and a real shift from the narrative from zero energy to zero carbon or zero greenhouse gas emissions. The short term, we wrap our arms around greenhouse gas. And then finally, the recognition that we need to work on these issues at community scale as well as at individual building scale. That again, zero net energy achieved annually on an individual building does not resolve all of these issues. And so we need to be tackling them at community scale. And there's a lot of moving in that direction all over North America and the planet. Next slide. Okay, so another or one example of how this is playing out is many conversations about community microgrids and advanced community energy systems, where within a given limited geographic locale, we are looking for demonstration projects that include both local clean energy generation, local energy storage, the ability to upgrade existing buildings to higher levels of efficiency, all new construction being zero energy, zero carbon, zero fossil fuels, and the ability to control these loads and island in the event of an emergency. So all the microgrids would be connected at a larger scale, but have the ability to be controlled unto themselves in the case of an outage or another emergency, provide the critical services in those events. Next slide, please. Got another, okay, there we go. And then I think this is my wrap-up point, is we also need to be concerned with the embodied carbon in our construction projects. That for many years and even decades since I've been involved in this work, embodied carbon was sort of viewed as, well, yeah, okay, that's important, but it's not as important as operating carbon. Let's go to the next slide, Tim. More recent analysis suggests that that's really not the case. And in fact, again, when we start to look at the nearer term horizon, we start to realize embodied carbon matters quite a lot. So the segment of the graph that I've highlighted here, the second clump from the top, illustrates in a conceptual way what we're referring to as the time value of carbon broken down by phases. So this bit I've circled in gold represents the front end load, the embodied carbon that goes into constructing a new zero net energy facility. So something that's highly efficient in its ongoing operations. And you can see that the embodied emissions there really dwarf the operating energy over time. And so when we look at this lifespan, again, so this represents the first, say, 5 to 10 years or so in getting a building up and running. And all of that is just an initial investment. And that's much, much greater. And that's all going to happen in this critical, let's say, next 12 years that the International Panel for Climate Change tells us we have to act. Whereas the operating energy, that's all downstream. So we really have to be very much more focused than we have been on embodied carbon. Next slide, Tim. So performing life cycle analyses that look at embodied carbon is going to be, I think, a tool that's very, very important to the design community going forward, as well as energy modeling. So we need to be looking at both. So this final slide is just gives you links to a number of the what I like to think are most useful resources. I've had some involvement or deep involvement in 3 of the 4 and significant involvement in the 4th. So that is pretty much it for me. And I think there are probably a few questions, and I can also hang out a little bit longer than the hour if Tim can as well.
Yeah, thank you, Ann, and thanks for this wonderful encyclopedic overview of net zero. Really great. We have a question from Andre, and to the other participants, please do chat your questions into the chat box. So, Ann, do you see an increasing number of well-established builders transitioning to zero energy building? And I guess that is a geographically specific phenomenon. And then I have a follow-on about that as well. But what is the overall trend that you see for kind of mainstream builders?
Yeah, I think it's, as I mentioned, we're really sort of seeing the tip of that iceberg right now. And I think it's going to shift dramatically. Right now, a couple of the larger builders that are getting more than their toes wet. Meritage is a very large national builder. Thrive is a very prominent home builder in the Denver area. And there are quite a few other examples around the country of production builders who are getting into this space. So,
and of course, you have new legislation in California, right, that all new residential construction must include PV or photovoltaics starting in 2020. Where does that relate to energy codes? Is zero energy on the horizon for new construction in California?
That is a great question, and I think maybe the forces that I really summarized at the end of the duck curve issues, sort of grid balancing on an hour-to-hour to day-to-day, season-to-season basis are starting to emerge as quite important in the state achieving its ambitious climate reduction, greenhouse gas reduction, climate change goals. And so I really foresee a shift from the emphasis on zero net energy to, again, zero carbon and what's being variously referred to as grid-friendly design or grid harmonization. I still see zero energy design as being hugely important, primarily because it provides a very concrete goal for efficiency, whether or not the solar goal, or the solar array that's provided on a home actually meets 100% of load or not, which it may not, for example, in existing homes. It's still very compelling way of achieving the very, very high level of efficiency. Whereas in the past, well, we've had our goals expressed, for example, as percent better than energy code, which is a much squishier goal. So where codes are going remains to be seen, but I think there's going to be much more emphasis on this grid harmonization issue.
And what is your perspective on the Midwest? I'm biased, of course. My home community of Champaign-Urbana did originate the locale homes there in Champaign-Urbana, and it also originated the Passive House Institute. We're also well known for commercial lead construction, a lot of commercial lead construction here in Illinois. But what is your perspective from a net zero point of view on the Midwest, especially Illinois?
Sure. I can't say I can really comment a lot on Illinois, except, certainly Chicago has shown a lot of leadership in a number of green building efforts, as well as the kudos that you mentioned for Champaign-Urbana. The Midwest as a whole, I guess what I would say is it's a very mixed bag. There are real pockets of significant leadership there, as you have alluded to, and there are also more laggardly elements. It's a very interesting area. Minneapolis is another area where there's a lot of advanced activity. And then there are parts of Wisconsin, for example, where there's almost devoid of advanced energy activity, and then some isolated pockets where there is. So it's an interesting area of the country.
How does the coalition conduct its surveys?
Okay, so we do a lot of outreach via partner organizations. So our sort of fundamental principle is zero energy folks tend to hang out together, and so our best way of reaching them is through these allied organizations. So we've got a lengthy roster, probably 20, 30, 40, 50 organizations that are range in scope from national to regional to local that we reach out to, and they in turn reach out to their constituencies via social media, newsletters, websites, and so forth. And there are also probably a smaller group, maybe a dozen organizations that actually collect data themselves. And so they share their data with us. And so we aggregate from all of those sources. Other than the data that we receive directly from organizations that I mentioned, which includes, for example, the Department of Energy's Zero Energy Ready Homes program, Earth Advantage Institute, International Living Future Institute, and so forth. The direct outreach we send to our website, netzeroenergycoalition.com, where we have the data input form. So people can put in their projects there. It takes about a minute per project to enter the data. So it's really simple. And then we, dump that all into a master database and crunch the numbers from there.
Excuse me. And then from a branding perspective, you mentioned it's really about net zero carbon or zero carbon. And then in the passive house community, I know there's a lot of banter about energy positive. Do you have your finger on the pulse of what's beyond net zero? Is there a term that's coming for super energy efficient buildings?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think in this field, we really struggle with terminology that falls trippingly off the tongue and communicates what we want. People have trouble with green and sustainable and net zero and passive, and nobody is really happy with all of the terms. So not sure where we're going there. Based on some very anecdotal investigation that was done by a colleague recently, a term that seemed to work well with a particular group of people was a clean energy home.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know clean energy is a term that's also being adopted by Southern California Edison, which is our second largest investor-owned utility here in California. It's an electric-only utility, so they are very much behind the zero carbon, decarbonization, electrification, all those labels that go together, and they feel pretty confident in use of clean energy home as well.
Yep. We have another question from Andre. Do you have an opinion about structural insulated panels? I guess that's a very broad question, and it really depends. I talk to a lot of people about SIPs myself, who you talk to, but what is your perspective on SIPs?
Yeah, so I'm actually a fan of SIPs. I wrote a book back in 1998 for the Natural Resources Defense Council with the scintillating title of Efficient Wood Use in Residential Construction, a Practical Guide to Saving Wood, Money, and Forests. And one of the chapters was on SIPs. I think not all SIPs are created equal, and I think my main reservation at this point about SIPs is the choice of the insulating core. And because of, again, global warming potential and broader climate impacts. But I think they're really a terrific system and would love to see more adoption.
I did get to visit Thrive in Denver, and so I was glad to hear you point out that developer in particular. They are building tract homes that are zero energy ready on a large scale, hundreds and hundreds of homes a year. They've gone back and forth on SIPs though themselves,
Yeah.
It's logic would tell you, okay, build these things, build these wall units in a factory under controlled conditions, or even bigger units, and we do see that as well. But they go back and forth between using SIPs. They do have some volume of SIP construction, but a lot of it is still stick built. So it's a mixed bag, but good question. Well, unless we have other questions from the audience, which we could take a few minutes, and so if you do have questions, please chat those in. And I just want to thank you, Anne, for making the time. That was a really wonderful presentation, and your graphics are amazing as well. So looking forward to getting those up on the, I'll have those on the website in the next 24 hours. So people can just check out cecco.com and /solar webinar. That's how you get to the webinar landing page. I do want to point out that we have this webinar on a monthly basis. It's the last Tuesday of the month. Next month in April, we have the Illinois Solar Industry Update, 10 Things You Want to Know with John Carson of Trajectory. And then in May, we have Nico Johnson coming on from Suncast to talk about 5 steps to energy independence. And in particular, we're going to drill down on the commercial industrial solar industry in the Midwest. So looking forward to that. All right. Well, thank you so much, Anne, and thank you everybody for attending and for watching SolarWorks for Illinois. We look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you all.
Thanks, Tim.